to the general rule. I just want to explain a little bit about how the evening's going to work before I introduce the two recorders who are going to talk to us tonight. What we're going to do is we're going to have Nairi first talking about butterflies. We're going to take the Q&A straight away after Nairi, the Q&A that relates to butterflies. And then we're going to move on to Andrew, who's going to talk about birds. And then we'll have Andrew's Q&A. And if there's any time left at the end, perhaps we can have a more general session. Okay, then without further ado, we've got Nairi and Andrew here tonight. They're both dedicated recorders. We are all, I'm sure, extremely grateful for the work they do. I think it's an incredibly large and difficult job to be a recorder. There's a lot of information to collate. You have to order it, you have to think about it, you have to present to this occasion, and write a long report for the annual review. It's a very big job, and the annual review is a publication that I certainly look forward to enormously every year. I don't know what I would do without the annual reviews to look back through, to find out where things have been seen and so on in previous years. So I'm enormously grateful to people who take on these roles, and I'm sure you all feel the same as I do about that. So thank you, Nairi and Andrew, for everything you do. And Nairi, without further ado, perhaps we'll start the butterfly talk. Thank you.
That's looking good, Nairi, thanks.
Thank you. Okay, hello everybody. Probably most of you know, as Helen's just said, I'm Nairi Fernley, and I've taken over starting from this year from Diane Morris. So last year, all Diane and myself and Paul Millard were all working on the butterflies. So first of all, I'd like to say a big thank you to Diane for all the work that she's done over the years that she's been doing the recording along with Paul. I think she's done a huge chunk of the work, and she's also done a lot of work behind the scenes, producing new spreadsheets to make our lives as recorders easier. We've got an excellent spreadsheet now for people to send in records that we can send out to anybody, which is in exactly the same format as our master spreadsheet, so we can basically just copy and paste it straight over. And she's also done other spreadsheets. She's done one that calculates the percentage increase or decrease for each of the species in our area over the 10-year average, which is what you'll see in the annual report. And Diana's also been working with a group in Addingham, helping them set up some transects and helping them with butterfly identification. And she's still going to be involved with that, even though she's no longer going to be butterfly recorder for the Wharfedale Nats. So I'm just going to move on. We're going to just give an overview of what's been happening in 2020. So here are two graphs, one from 2019 on the left and the one on the right from 2020 with the coverage. So you can see it's fairly similar. There's a few less spots in 2020, but obviously we had COVID and we were restricted. So 2019 was our best year ever, with over 4,000 records of 29 species. And 2020 was actually our second best year, despite the restrictions we had. I think a large part of this was also due to Diane and her Addingham Transect group, because we got quite a large number of records from them. You'll see we had 29 species in 2019 and one less in 2020. We actually had silver wash fritillary and clouded yellow missing in 2020, but the purple hair streak returned after an absence in 2019. So I'm now going to just move on and talk about a few species in it a little bit more about a few species in detail. So I'm going to start with the brimstone. Lovely butterfly, and on any sunny day now you could see one flying about. So I actually write a report for this species for the Yorkshire branch of Butterfly Conservation. So I do a report every year for the whole of Yorkshire of this species. And something that's quite a nice thing to do if you ever get a chance is to rear butterflies from caterpillars. So someone else, not from within our area, but took me to a site where there was lots of caterpillars for the brimstone and insisted that I take just 1 or 2 home and to rear if I could. So here we are, we've got a caterpillar of the brimstone, and underneath the leaf you can see it starting to turn into a pupa. It's quite amazing to watch. It takes it about 2 days to change from a caterpillar into a full pupa. And then here we've got a pupal case. This is actually after the butterfly has emerged, but it's just to give you an idea of the shape and how it's got itself attached to the leaf. So then I thought it would be quite a nice thing when the adults emerged. We do have some older buckthorn in our garden, which is one of the fruit plants. So I thought it'd be quite a nice idea to get a picture of one on that. And as I was trying to get it to move off my finger and onto the bush, it opened its wings out. So this is actually quite a rare picture because you very, very rarely see the upper side of a brimstone. Whenever they land, they always land with the wings closed. So you don't normally see this shot. So I was quite pleased with that. I was frantically trying to get my camera in the right hand and the butterfly sat on my left hand, but I managed to get this shot. And then here it is. This is the same insect sitting on his older buckthorn. So I'm now going to move on. You can probably most of you recognise this as an oak tree. And this is the host plant for the purple hairstreak. And purple hairstreak spends all its time mainly living up in the top of the oak trees. So if you want to go looking for this, you need binoculars. And last year, because I had a bit more time in our local area, some friends of ours have some land and there's public footpath as well with lots of oak trees. And so I went on several occasions with my binoculars looking in all these trees. And I did actually manage to find a couple. Now there is actually a purple hairstreak on this shot, but spotting it would be very difficult. So this shot is not the best of shots because it's zoomed in dramatically, but they'll sit for ages without even moving. So if you're looking with your binoculars, ideally you want to be looking for a little bit of movement of them flitting about and then try and watch them land. I did actually find this stationary, which was a miracle. And then the next miracle was actually getting a picture that actually had it on somewhere. It took me ages to find it myself. So I've got a couple of shots in. So this is one feeding on the ground. They don't really come and nectar down on flowers, but they will often come down. They tend to quite like landing on gravel tracks and things like this. This was actually taken at Bishop Wood at Carewood last summer. And as you can see, it's pretty camouflage and no purple on the underside. But if you're really lucky, you might get one to do this. This is not one of my photographs. This is one that Diane got from the internet, but it must be stunning to see one like that. So it'd be great if anybody's feeling like looking in oak trees in our area, because we're pretty sure that this is an under-recorded butterfly. It could be anywhere really. I mean, the place where I saw this, we have seen one once years ago, similar area, but I found one several hundred meters away in a totally different oak tree, which is probably not from the same colony. So you never know, you could find some new sites for us. And now move on to the white letter hairstreak, which the same could be said about the white letter hairstreak in that it spends most of its time up in the top of trees. But this time it's elm trees, including wych elm. The only difference with the white letter hairstreak is that it will come down and nectar on flowers. And even though I've very rarely seen them myself, I have found that it does seem to quite like creeping thistle. So again, this is another species that you could all keep an eye out for. We're sure that there's probably sites in our area where it's never been recorded, but it's probably present. So it's always worth keeping your eye out. And again, binoculars are required, usually. So then I'm going to move on to the last hair streak that we have in our area, the green hair streak. And this is a butterfly that I also write a report for the Yorkshire branch. So I do records for the whole of Yorkshire. And we're very lucky in our area because we actually have a huge number of this butterfly, much more common than the other two hair streaks, much easier to see. It lives on bilberry, so it's a nice low plant. Binoculars are still handy because they are quite flighty and they're also exceptionally small. Most people are quite surprised at their size. If you know what a small copper looks like, they're similar size to that. So this was taken on Otley-Shevin last summer. And it's lovely, and quite often if the sun shines with this lovely metallic green, and I put this one in really shiny green and you can see the streaks on it. Now it is possible to identify individual butterflies by the number of streaks that they've got. So this next one you can see is much less streaks on it and the sun's not shining, so it's not quite as brilliant metallic green, it's a slightly duller green. They can be remarkably camouflaged when they're monster bilberries like this. Although once you get your eye in, they are actually, when the sun shines and they're bright green, they do actually stand out quite well. And again, just look for a little bit of movement flitting about. But don't expect to see the green when they're flying because the upper surface is brown. So when they're in flight, they've actually look quite brown, almost like a dead leaf blowing in the wind. It took me a couple of years before I actually saw one, even when I was sort of going to the right spot to find them. And I was actually lucky enough last summer to find a mating pair, which was the first time I've ever seen a mating pair. And I put this in again because you can see that the top one is a much shinier green, the bottom with the sun at a slightly different angle, much duller looking green. It's a stunning little butterfly. I really love this little butterfly. So we're now going to move on to the Northern Brown Argus. And this is really Paul's speciality because he does a transect at Kilnsey for this species. But there's a few things to mention about this species, particularly this year, because in 2020, it was the earliest ever known record in Britain on the 20th of May. It was once seen on the 20th of May around 10 years ago in Cumbria. But Paul saw it up at Lee Green at Grasswood on the 20th of May. He saw 2 insects, and normally he wouldn't start his transect until the last week in May. So it was a little bit by chance that he spotted one. So we've got the upper surface here. Obviously, this is a male. The females are a little bit more orange. It's very similar to a female common blue, but the female common blue has even more distinct orange markings. And it also tends to, around its body, on the hairs on its body are often a bluish colour on the common blue. So I've also got now a shot of the underside. And again, it's very, very similar to a common blue. It is a slightly smaller butterfly, but when they're in flight, it's very difficult to tell them. If you can see my cursor on the screen here, the female common blue has an extra marking on its forewing here. But in my experience, they quite often, when they land, they shut this wing down. So it's actually hidden behind the hind wing. So another thing to look for is the markings here in a slightly different position. But again, it's pretty difficult sometimes in the field to tell them apart. So don't worry if you can't tell them apart. If you can get a photo, that's brilliant, because it's quite often we can tell from a photo. So I've got a picture on here on its fruit plant, the common rock rose. So the other thing, we think that the early emergence last year was probably partly due to climate change. And climate change is something that could seriously affect this butterfly because it's actually our most threatened species. Because there's a very similar species, the brown argus, which is always been associated more southern parts of Britain, but it's actually moving northwards, believed to be due to climate change, and there's potential that we might get hybrids interbreeding. So at the moment, all our northern brown argus in our recording area are all purebred, and we'd like to keep it that way if we can. There is some evidence of populations in Scandinavia where both species actually coexist on the same site as two totally separate species. There's also evidence in this country where genetic testing has been done, where some of them actually have the genes for both the brown Argus and the northern brown Argus. But it's not necessarily known that it's recent inbreeding. There's possibly even back as far as the last ice age when these butterflies were first coming back. So there's a lot more work to be done on that, and people are on with that work. Another thing, I'm now going to move on to the egg, because it has a relatively short flight period, and obviously where we are in Yorkshire, the weather's not always great. So one of the things you can do is look for eggs. And they're actually surprisingly easy to spot when you get your eye in. The northern brown Argus always lays its eggs on the upper surface of the leaf, like you can see on the centre there. They're not necessarily right in the centre like this one is. They're not always on the midribs, anywhere on the top of the leaf. But they're quite bright white, and even better if you have a hand lens. If you think you've spotted one, you can get your hand lens out, and they look like little miniature golf balls close up. The brown Argus, that always lays on the underside of the leaf, so that's another way of distinguishing as well between the species. So I'm quickly going to move on now to the Vanessids, because Paul actually noticed that we seem to have years where each one of these species suddenly has a good year or a bad year, and 4 of the species this year didn't have particularly great years. So we'll move on to this graph. So the comma didn't have a very good year at all this year. That's the dark blue line at the bottom, so it's gone quite down there. The peacock as well, that is the orange line, so that was much higher last year and it's plummeted way down this year, so I don't really know for the peacock why that's happened. Red Admiral as well, that's down, and it had a really good year in 2017, but since then it's gone down again. Maybe due to weather condition. It doesn't overwinter particularly well in this country, so it can be due to the weather during the winters. Painted Lady, that had a real dramatic crash. That's the paler orange line. We actually had 2,037 records in 2019, and we were down to just 13 in 2020. But the good news is Small Tortoise Shell, that had a really good year. So that's the blue line here. So that was the one that did well in 2020. So who knows which it'll be next year. Perhaps it's the comma that will start increasing again. So just a little bit about the orange tip, because this is one of our most easily recognisable butterflies, and it's one that probably most of you see, and an easy one to identify, so a good one to start by sending records in for. But of course the female doesn't have the orange, so it can be mistaken from some of the other whites. So one thing to look for, if you can get a sighting of the underside, is it's totally distinct from any other white with this lovely mottled green coloration. This is actually a male, but both male and female have this same pattern. You can just see the orange there that identifies it as a male. The reason I put this shot in is because we've also got eggs, and we've got 2 different coloured eggs there, because when they lay them, they tend to be a slightly paler colour, and then they go to a deeper orange as they get older. So now we've got the wall butterfly. Now nationally, this is not doing that well. It's declining in a lot of areas, but it's actually quite stable in our area. It's a very pretty thing. It's quite unmistakable, really, if you get a good view of it with this lovely patterning on the upper surface. And it will come and nectar on flowers. It's quite lively usually. But if you get the underside, you can see that that is actually fairly dullish colour. If you don't actually see one land, it's nearly impossible to find. Even if you see it land, it's quite difficult to find. But it is quite distinct from any other butterfly if you see the undersurface with those nice little circles and the dots in the middle, and quite attractive, I think, even the undersurface. So I'm just going to finish by just saying a little bit about sending in records. I mean, sending in records is really important. All the records from the Wharfedale Naturalists Society that get sent to us, they then get sent to the Vice County Recorder and also then onto a national database. So they can be used for all sorts of different things. They can be used for planning permission, planning applications. If people put in planning applications and they know that there's a rare species on that site. Farmers applying for agro-environmental schemes for subsidies and things. Forestry Commission, when they're doing new plantings, they're certainly at the moment liaising in Scotland with butterfly conservation to try and make it more butterfly friendly. You've also got nature reserves as well, or you know, if you know that you've got a species that's maybe not particularly common or even common, you can aim some of your management towards improving it for the butterflies. And of course, many organisations, you know, like the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, they can get grants to do work and things like that. And so all this data is all really helpful. And butterfly conservation, there's lots of other organisations that put in data. I'm sure many of you have heard of the State of Nature reports that come out, and that's like a collaboration between 70 organisations roughly, I think. And so when I'm looking at the things I've just mentioned, like the farming schemes and subsidies, planning applications, grants, it's all put together with other things as well, so it can make a huge difference. And also records, even if it's a common species, looking at how things are moving with climate change, we can see if things are moving northwards. I mean, until recent years, common was absolutely unheard of in Scotland, and now they're all over, certainly in southern Scotland, and moving north all the time. So all this data is really important. So as I've said, Diana's got an excellent spreadsheet which I can send out to any of you. All we need is your name. This is mainly if with any queries, and also a lot of you like to see your names in the publications if you've got a first sighting or a last sighting or a peak count, and it will also go into the Yorkshire report. If you don't want your name included, that can be excluded with a data protection. You don't have to have your name included in any reports. We need the site, ideally with a grid reference. We do have to put a grid reference in on our records, so if you don't provide one, then we have to provide one from the information that you've given us. There is an excellent website for anybody with internet access for grid reference finder, and it basically, you just put the name of a town or a postcode in, and it comes up with like a Google Earth type map, and you just you can zoom in and out and find the exact spot where you saw something, and if you click on it, it will give you a 6-figure and a 10-figure grid reference. And 6 figures is perfectly all right for us, or even a 4-figure grid reference, which just narrows it down to a 1 kilometre square. I sometimes even just get a paper map out when people have sent in a record, and I sort of know where it is. I'll just we need a date, obviously, for each of the records, because another thing that we can do is like the weather. If we know dates when things are seen, I notice it when I do my reports for the Yorkshire branch, and I'm looking at the whole of Yorkshire. Sometimes when I start filling out the sheets, there can be a gap of a couple of weeks where there's not been a single butterfly of that species, my brimstone or my green hair streak, seen anywhere in Yorkshire. So I'm thinking, oh, maybe there was some rough weather for a while then. It's during its flight period. Obviously, we want to know the species and how many. It doesn't have to be totally exact. If there's loads of them flitting all over the place, then don't worry about being totally accurate. But it's a massive help to us if you can give us some kind of an idea, because occasionally we get people just putting several or lots, and obviously especially lots could is open to a vast amount of interpretation. It could be 10, it could be 50, it could be 100, it could be 500. So just a rough idea is really good for us. So just move on to my final slide now with a little green hair streak, and I put this one in because if you look carefully, it's waving its little front leg at you. Very pretty little butterfly. I'd just like to say I'm happy for any of you to send me photos if you want, not sure of identification, or if there's a species that you fancy seeing and you don't know where to see it or when it might be flying. We can look at our records and see when it's been flying in recent years, the dates. It's a good idea when to look for it, or we know sites where certain species are known to be seen. So I'm quite happy for people to contact me. If I don't know the answer, I'll ask Paul or try find out for you. So thank you very much. If there's any questions, I think Jeff will be going through them.
Thanks, Nairi. That's really kind of opened my eyes to how many more species there are around than I typically see in my little patch. So I need to try harder. Got time just for a couple of questions before we move on. But on the subject of recording and sending photos, what camera do you typically use to get these amazing shots?
Well, I've got a bridging camera. It's actually quite old now. It's a Nikon Coolpix P90. I haven't got a digital SLR. I haven't got an SLR at all anymore. I just find it, faffing about changing lenses, and we do a lot of walking, and sometimes we do a lot of mountain walking, and they don't want the weight. And so the bridging camera, it's the one I've got's got a 24 times optical zoom, which is handy. You do want to try get one with a good optical zoom. A lot of them, some of them are quite not very good optical zoom. I know that the one that Anne Riley uses, one of hers doesn't have a great optical zoom, and I think she tries with a different camera first and then moves on to the other if she can. But yeah, I mean, my advice is try get a long shot, even if it's out of focus, try get a shot from a distance, even if it's a bit blurred, or you can quite often get enough for an ID. And then if you get a shot at all, then try and move in a little bit closer and get one, a shot with it bigger in the screen, or having to use less zoom. That's okay. That's what I try and do, but often it's impossible.
And would you suggest that we use iRecord as a recording route? This may be a question more suitable for our next webinar in 2 weeks' time, where Catherine's going to talk about recording, but I don't know if you've got a view on it now.
If people put in them to iRecord, they don't come through to myself and Paul, so we don't really see them. Paul will see them as a vice counter recorder, but he is VC65, which is obviously not our recording area. Some people do use iRecord because they really like it, so you can still send your records to us as well. But if you send them to us as well, so that they're on our records for the Wharfedale Nats, if you could just mention that they've been entered on iRecord, because what we do is we just make a note in the comments box on our master that they've been entered on iRecord, and then when we send them to the vice counter recorder, he knows it's not, that it's a duplicate record. And so we just make a note of it on our spreadsheet if people just tell us. So it's fine to put them in on iRecord, but if we don't see them unless you send them to us.
Okay, that clarifies that, thank you. And are references using what 3 words, which narrows thing, I think, to 3 meters by 3 meters. I think there's a conversion into grid references anyway, but on there.
I've never used that, I have to admit. I've always thought, I've always thought it a bit pointless, because I always think, well, why don't you there's so many apps and things for phones that just give you a grid reference. I mean, I have an app on my phone and I just click on it and it'll give me a 10-figure grid reference for wherever I am. So I've always just thought, well, I might as well just click on the app for a grid reference as click on the 3 words. So I've never used it.
Right. I'll ask you one more question. I'm just trying it now to see if I can bring up a grid reference with it. This is a specific one from Helen. What time of year should we be looking to find purple hair streaks?
They're sort of a later butterfly, so you're looking sort of into July. I can certainly check on the records and find out the exact first and last record for it. But certainly you want to be into July and into August as well. I'm still seeing them. I can't actually remember exactly the first and last dates, but you're not going to be seeing it like in May and June. You've been to July really before you. Some people say look at it late after sort of around 4 or 5 o'clock in an afternoon that they're quite active. That's what David Howson told me, to look around 4 or 5 o'clock in an afternoon.
Okay, thank you. There are 1 or 2 more, but I think time's pressing on. I haven't managed to sort the technology out, but I will see if I can do that before the end. But I'm pretty sure there is a link across from what 3 words into normal grid references or traditional grid references. But thanks, Nari. Do stick around, because if we get a chance at the end, there's a couple more questions. But we'll move on now, Shemay, to Andrew, who's going to follow that as his challenge and give us a tour around the birds of the Wharfedale Nats area. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm just trying to get my right, and hopefully it's just coming through. Oh. It's still on the slide view rather than the screen show. Just slideshow. Just try again. How's that doing?
Just give it a second. It's still showing the slides rather than the view. Not sure why. It's done that thing again, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Do you want to just stop sharing and start again? And
yeah, will do.
Try that. Reassure the audience. We tried this wonderfully in practice earlier, and it got there. But give us a minute.
Right.
Now then, I did for a moment see your full screen there, but start again. It might just have been sharing the wrong.
I'm going to have to call it up again because I've had to close it down.
Yeah, that's okay. This was the bit where I threatened bad jokes, wasn't it? If you took a while.
Yeah, you did, definitely.
Yeah, but we'll spare people.
I need to hear them now.
There's still 76 people on, and I don't want to halve that with my humour. So, the reference I made before about our next webinar with Catherine Burton after the AGM in 2 weeks' time is going to do a presentation on how to be a recorder and the whole kind of thing about recording, as much as presenting back on the records as Andrew and Nari are doing this evening. So that'll certainly be of interest to anyone who's not been submitting records historically or is interested in becoming a recorder. So wish us luck this time. I fear, Andrew, what it might have started doing is sharing. The slideshow's opened on a different screen, and it's sharing the desktop of the slides format rather than sharing the slideshow itself.
Right.
If you just try stopping sharing, and when you go to share again, see if it gives you an option of a window that looks like the slideshow is already underway.
Back into the screen now.
Okay.
Right.
Last go, and if we get the same issue again, I'd suggest just carry on with the slides as they were. We can see them almost full screen.
Yeah. Right.
So if you screen share again, once you can get into the presentation. I'll tell you when that comes up.
So share screen.
Yeah.
And then click on the recorder, the PowerPoint.
Yeah, unless you can see a window that's already the slideshow itself. But if not, just go to the PowerPoint, I think.
Yeah, share it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, most of my screen certainly is full of the slide itself. So it's a shame, you know, not to have the full slideshow, but I think let's just press on with how you've got that now. I mean, by all means, try again, hitting slideshow and start from the first slide. But
what can you see? Because all I can see is the slide.
I can just see the slide with the preview down the left-hand side, but most
I can't even see that. I can't
Okay.
see anything apart from the PowerPoint.
just advance the slide and see what comes up here, if you can. Yeah, that will work fine for us if you go through it like that.
Right, I'll go through this. My apologies to everybody for this. I have no idea what's going wrong. Right, okay. 2020 was a particularly peculiar year, and it turned out to be quite an interesting year from a bird point of view as well. I was worried at the start of the year, well, not the start of the year, but in March, that with all the lockdowns and things happening, that we would see an absolute collapse in terms of bird records. In fact, as we'll see later on, we had rather the opposite, and actually had a remarkably good year, but it did have an impact, but in a slightly different way to the way I anticipated. If we actually look at a few stats from the year, what I would say about this year is about the way the survey works is the fact that inevitably with any form of citizen science, what we're really seeing is not so much a photograph of what there is, but more a painting. It's not scientifically rigorous. We're not doing scientific surveys and so on. So comparing one year to another can get quite tricky because we're seeing things slightly differently. So I prefer the analogy that rather than having a photograph each year, we've actually got a painting, an impression of what there is, but we can still derive a huge amount from that. If we actually look at the last year, a few stats, and I like to start off looking at the survey and looking at the recording and what we did. It was actually a remarkably good year. We had 12,800 records to date so far. There are actually still some coming in, which I'll go on to explain in a moment. If you actually look at the figures in the brackets are the last 2 years, and you'll actually see that in 2018, we had 7,500. Last year, we were right down to 5,800. So this year, we've had about 2 to 2.5 times as many records as we had in a previous year. We also actually remarkably saw an uptick in terms of the number of species. We were up to 156 species, which is an improvement on both 2018 and 19. I'll be going into these in a little bit more depth in a moment, but I'm just skimming over the ones to start with. In terms of actual contributions from the Wharfedale Nats members, it was 8,500 records this year, and I'll explain the difference as to why there's another 4,500 there to look at. But again, huge improvement, almost double the number that we received last year. So an absolutely fantastic effort. We do receive a lot of information from other organisations. The two ones that we exchange data with locally is the Bradford Ornithological Group, BOG, and the Addingham Environment Group, who have been brilliant this year and actually contributed just over 2,000 records, which is a huge increase on previous years. So their input has been invaluable this year. I also do a fair bit of trawling of social media. I'm a member of a number of WhatsApp groups, and those have again produced about another 2,000 records, so a very valuable source. And finally, our other big source of data is from the BTO, the British Trust for Ornithology, and really through two sources. The first is the web survey, the Wetland Bird Survey, where there are volunteers who survey. We actually have three areas covered at the moment. We have Otley Wetland, we have Knotford Nook, and we have Lindley Wood Reservoir, the areas covered in our patch. And I have access to that data. And finally, we have BirdTrack. And this is actually changing the entire profile of what our data is is looking like, because this year, for the first time, I've actually been able to access the BirdTrack data, or at least they've sent me data at the end of the year from BirdTrack. And that's actually changing the nature of what we can actually do with the records, because whereas up to now, I've been very heavily reliant on people sending it, and will remain so. Because we're able to access it, it's meant that I'm actually having to break the reporting down into 2 different stages. And the report that's going into the review, or has gone into the review this year, has been very much a report based on the records received from members and from those other sources above. Whereas the BirdTrack data has arrived in the back end of January, beginning of February, and will actually, once I've filtered and processed it, will actually derive another 10 to 12,000 records. So in total, we're looking at 20 to 22,000. To try and produce a report on that in time for this time of year is now impossible. So what we're now doing is an interim report, which is very much the member picture. And then later on in the year, I'm hoping to, well, not hoping, I will be producing a more detailed report using the BirdTrack data, which will, rather than this report, which is basically a picture of what there is, the BirdTrack, with the BirdTrack in, we should be able to do a much greater degree of analysis. So just to take a look at some of that data in a little bit more depth, I mentioned the member recording. One of the issues I raised last year was a worry that the fact we were increasingly reliant on fewer and fewer people. And you can actually see there, we've got the last 4 years, we've got the number of sightings contributed by members, we've got the number of recorders, and we've got the percentage of the records coming from the 4 most prolific recorders. And you'll see that for the last 3 years, that figure has been creeping up and up, and is roughly half. In fact, last year almost reached 60%. I'm relieved to say that this year that's dropped, and it's about a third now, which is a much healthier balance. It means that if anybody drops out and we lose one of these prolific recorders, we are actually receiving data from a broader number of people. We also had a little uptick in terms of the number of recorders. That's been declining the last few years. But this year, fortunately, we saw an uptick, and I'm hoping that will carry on. In terms of the records themselves, as I mentioned, we're up to 12,800, and you can see from this graph that means that this is the highest number of records that we've actually received in the last 14, 15 years. I only have records going back that far, which is a fantastic effort. And in a COVID-y year, actually really surprised me. And I like to think it's partly because we've all stuck at home, so we can all do a lot more birding locally rather than going off on holidays and things like that. And we'll also be looking at the distribution of that, and I think that we'll see that that's been affected by COVID as well. If we break that down into the north and the south is north of Barden Bridge and the south of Barden Bridge. You can see that the last few years in the north, the numbers of records have been declining. Very sadly, we used to get data from the Upper Wharfedale Field Society. That's fallen away since they lost their recorder. And you can see the dip starting in 2017. Well, fortunately, a lot of that dip has been recovered. You can see that the 2020 figure has bounced back up to 2017. The proportion of data from the north is staying at the lower end. We used to get about a quarter of our data from the north. It's down to about 14, 15% now. But that's more to do, I think, this year, particularly with the huge amount of records, or number of records, that we've actually received in the southern part of the area. And you can see that in the bottom graph, where there's been that absolutely huge upsurge of records, well over 10,000 this year from the south of the area. I did a little bit of analysis to look at that in a little bit more depth as to where that was coming from. And this table here breaks our area down slightly more. We use these areas for our recording. The yellow areas are all the northern ones. The blue areas are in the south. And what they show is that I went for the 2018 records because 2019 was a very exceptional year in terms of the low numbers and things, and it didn't seem to be fit any pattern. So I've gone back a little bit just to the year before, which was much more, I think, much more typical from what I've seen. And you can see there that the numbers are changing quite dramatically in certain parts of the area. If we go from the north of the area southwards, you'll see that Langstrouhdale, for instance, we're still seeing a decline in the number of records. We only had 102 records from that northern section, down almost 50% compared to 2018. The rest of the north, we actually did see a reasonable rise, apart from Grimrith Reservoir, which was very similar to 2018. Grassington in particular saw a huge rise, but we, you know, from 483, we had almost 1,000 records from Grassington. If you look in the south, you'll actually see that Bolton Abbey had a decline as well. The Washburn maintained a slight uptick, but absolutely enormous increases, both from Otley Wetland and from the rest of the southern area. That's basically the main Wharf Valley outside Otley Wetland. The wetland saw a big upsurge in records last year to 1,300, so that really reflects last year's increase. But we had this huge increase in the rest of the south, and I think what that, to me, I felt that really showed about how much we staying local. Our more extreme areas, Langstrouhdale, Grimwith, places like that, people were just not getting out there. Bolton Abbey was pretty inaccessible for quite a while during lockdown. And what we were seeing was an increase more in more local areas. And if we look at this table, what I did was looked at the specific settlements in the south of the area. Addingham, as I mentioned, had this huge increase in records from the Addingham Environment Group. And the Addingham location, tight in on the village itself, we had almost 2,000 records from there. We had additional ones from the AEG, from Low Mill and from Addingham Moorside, but we had something like a 2,000% increase in Addingham with the records from there. IBMO stands for Ilkley, Burley, Menster, and Otley, which I combined the figures for, and you can see there that well over 200% increase. And I think it actually really did reflect the fact that numbers were, people were staying local, staying close to home. And that really showed, it's not shown up here very clearly on the slide, but I think that showed by the fact that something like 30% of all our records this year were garden sightings, which will have obviously affected the nature of the data and the nature of what we're actually seeing and the patterns we're seeing. If we move a bit on to the birds themselves, as I said in the introduction, we've seen an increase the last couple of years in species. This shows species over the last 15 years, 17 years now. And you'll see that from 2010 onwards, there was a fairly steady trend downwards with a couple of little up blips, but until about 2017, the red line is the 5-year trailing average. You'll see that there was a steady decline. The last 2 or 3 years, that decline seems to have gone into reverse, fortunately. And we've seen that figure stabilize, if anything, slightly upwards. So hopefully we've stabilized at around about 155 species within our catchment area. That decline, if we look at the next set of graphs, that decline is probably very much down to the decline in recording in the northern part of our area. If you look at the southern graph, you'll see that the numbers of species have stayed pretty steady. There was a little bit of a down curve, and that last 3 years of up curve is reflected there. But basically, the number of species we see in the south has stayed pretty steady in the 150, 160 area. In the north and the northern areas, we've seen a big decline. species. And if you take the 156 species that we had this year, there were only 2, black grouse was one, and I can't remember off the top of my head what the other one was. But there are only 2 species that did not appear in the south. We're not getting those northern only species coming through that we were back in the 2010-12 period. So I think that's where the decline in species numbers has really come through. If we go on to what we actually have seen over the last few years as well. This graph shows the distribution, the geographical distribution of species, and the number of species that appear at 60 or more sites. One of my predecessors, John Flood, did a huge amount of work dividing our catchment up into designated locations, designated sites, so that we could standardize our recognition of geographical distribution. So every place is allocated to a site or a location. And what we're seeing here is that what we're looking at there are the number of species that have appeared in the year in 60 or more locations. And you'll see that back in 2009, 2010, we were getting a dozen or more. The last few years, that's dipped quite remarkably. In fact, last year, no species was seen at more than 60 sites. This year, the numbers are better, and we actually had 4. The most widespread is the one that's been at the top of the pile for the last few years, which is curlew, which was at 66 different locations throughout the year. The other 3 were buzzard on 64, chaffinch on 62, and red kite on 61. Willow warblers made a big resurgence this year and were seen at 59, but just underneath. So hopefully we will see a little bit of an uptick carrying on with that after this year. So what was actually seen, those are the most common, the widespread one. What did we actually see this year in terms of the rarities? These are listed here along with our friendly marsh tit. Listed here are all the birds that were seen this year that were not seen in 2019, and it's quite a list. So we have the marsh tit, we have pintail and pochard and scaup, or wetland birds, knot, spotted redshank, greenshank, or waders. We actually had 2 sightings of kittiwake, one of a dead juvenile in Grassington, so that was a pretty definitive identification. Sandwich tern was seen over Otley, first time since pre-2010. Chetty's warbler was a fairly remarkable identification. That was heard at Otley Wetland for the first time in April, and Chetty's has also been heard at the Bradford Group's Stockbridge Reserve for the first time in the past 12 months. So they are definitely moving northwards. Rock pipit on Barden Moor, Lapland bunting, also see. So these were all, and a lot of these birds have not been seen for 8 or 9 years. So some really excellent sort of rarities to pick up. The 3 in red at the bottom, honey buzzard, black-tailed godwit, and willow tit, were all birds that were seen in 2019, but were not seen in the previous years before that. And so definitely worthy of note, because 2019 we recorded them as one-offs, but in fact, they've actually made reappearances this year. And as someone said, for instance, honey buzzard, we have some fabulous terrain for honey buzzard. So, our fingers crossed, we may see a little bit more of it in future. What wasn't the downside? What were the birds that we missed in 2020? The ringed plover disappeared off our radar this year. That's been around for a while and was certainly seen in 2 or 3 locations last year, particularly Linleywood Reservoir, but that was not registered. The bittern has been seen on a number of occasions at Otley Wetland, but didn't make an appearance last year. Mediterranean gull again is a scarce species that's been seen for a couple of years, but wasn't here. And the lesser spotted woodpecker is a resident. There is one privately owned site where it's fairly, it is pretty solidly resident. However, this year with lockdown came at just the time when one would expect to get out and see them before the leaves were coming in, and whilst you can still hear them, because to see them is pretty tricky, and they weren't seen. So hopefully they're still there. We just need to see them post lockdown. The other birds there, ruddy shelduck, white stork, ruff, great grey shrike, hooded crow, waxwing, yellow-browed warbler, were all seen in 2019, not in 2020, but they were all one-offs in 2019. So hopefully they will be seen again. And in fact, we already have a record this year of white stork appearing in Ockley, as seen by several observers only a few days ago. So that's at least one bird that's going to make an appearance in next year. Other highlights this year.
Andrew, can I just note time is pressing, so keep
okay.
Pace, please.
Yeah, other highlights this year. I will zoom through these because I want to just make a few more slides relevant to them. We're seeing. In fact, I will move on from that because I will cover those more in a few moments. What I wanted to look at was a few things about what's actually happened to birds more generally, and bear in mind that these are just based on the records that we currently have. One of the positives that we're seeing is the increasing presence of little egret, and you can see along the bottom there the fact that 2010, 2011, 12 hardly appearing at all. The graph of that is distinctly kicking out. In 2020, the number of sightings doubled. The corollary of that is, unfortunately, we're seeing a decrease in heron. And although there was an increase with the increased records that we got in 2020, the general trend is sadly down. Another pairing that is a bit of a contrast. Barn owl is making a superb recovery from the lows of the late noughties. 2009, it was only seen at one location. It was seen at 40 locations last year. Little owl, on the other hand, we are seeing a definite decrease, and the little uplit probably does nothing to think, and that's a national issue as well. The other owls are not quite as severe as the little owl, but we are definitely seeing downward trends, and the tawny owl is reflecting the national trend, where there has been a distinct slide in it. Again, a recovery this year, but nothing back to the levels that we've seen even only just 2 years ago. Falcons, I wanted to highlight this because, again, we're seeing a slight change around the fortunes. Kestrel has been on a steady decline for the last 5-10 years. Big uptick this year. Maybe we've actually just been under recording it. We'll see over the next couple of years. The other three falcons have seen a swap round. Hobby seems to be on the increase for the last 5 years. The yellow line has been ticking up from the low of 2016. Peregrine, on the other hand, has been on a steady, and Merlin as well, have probably been on fairly steady slides, and the peregrine sightings last year were particularly disappointing. Two other raptors I just wanted to highlight. Red kite has reached the highest number of sites it's been seen at on our records. That's been on a steady increase and moving further and further north. Sparrowhawk, after several years of decline, now seems to had a couple of years of movement upwards, and that seems to be looking at those numbers are back up to the 2011 numbers, so distinctly healthier. And finally, with the birds, I wanted to highlight what a good year the wagtails have had. Huge, big recovery numbers, much more so than you'd expect even from the records, both with pied and grey wagtail. And it was even a good year for yellow wags. There was a lot of sightings around Ockley, but there were others as well, and generally an excellent year. So I've had to slide over those at the end. Basically, with a lot of time we lost at the start, but basically, just like Nairi, I'd just like to put in a plea to continue sending records in. I hope to produce a a more detailed report, as I say, at the end of the later on this year, which will be in addition to the review that you will see in the annual report. But in the meantime, I'd be extremely grateful. I've standardized on my personal email address. It's caused, there's been a little bit of confusion this year with 2 different email addresses. So we've chopped the wnsbirds@gmail.com. If stuff comes into it, I will still pick it up, but I'll only dip into there every now and again and focus very much on my personal email address. And that way I can guarantee I can acknowledge much more rapidly any records coming in. Otherwise, very much along the same lines of what Nairi was saying in terms of the information and the data. And there you have it. An exciting year, very, very different year, but hopefully a good basis for going forward in the future. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Andrew, and thanks for racing on after the technical glitches in the middle, and thanks also to the audience for sticking with us. We've still got the same numbers as we had at the start, so that's great. There are a few questions, and I'll sort of prioritise those most relevant to tonight. There's one about what should people report when? If you're out seeing birds that you see all the time, should you report them, or just the rarer ones? We'll get to that if we can, but the one's more immediate for this presentation rather than perhaps 2 weeks' time. Andrew, is there anything you would say about patterns regarding curlews and trends in their numbers in the area?
Well, the interesting thing is with the curlew, the numbers seem to be holding up with the reports. As I said, it tops our list in terms of geographical distribution. And when you looked at the figures last year, it did look as if the number of locations, and I think locations are often a more reliable thing than just the number of records, because you can see 100 duplicate records from one area. Curlew's traditionally been good geographically because, of course, it winters in the valley and then, summers up in the breeds up on the moors. I think the patterns seem to be holding. I personally have a real worry with all the development plans that we're now seeing, the building that's being proposed in Ilkley and Burley and things, because they're all on prime curlew wintering grounds. The Wheatley Road development alone, I mean, I was counting 150, 200 curlew feeding on those fields only a couple of months ago. And if we start destroying the feeding fields, we're going to start destroying the population. So at the moment, it's holding up well, but I'm not happy about what's coming up in the future.
Indeed, indeed. Thanks for that. Which organisations do we forward our bird records to? Right,
we forward to the Yorkshire Naturalists Union, who produced the Yorkshire report, and then that then goes forward to national. We also go to both the West Yorkshire and North Yorkshire ecological databases, similar to the butterfly ones do. So they all go to that, and also to the BTO. I'm currently organising how to load up the thousands of records that we've got. The corollary of that is I do get the BTO. One thing I would say about the BTO, which I think people do need to know, if you submit data to the BTO, we will get it. We'll get it at the end of the year, but we will get it. What we won't get, though, is any name attached to it. It will come through anonymously. So I know several people who record and send stuff in and say, well, don't worry, you'll get it through the BTO. Yes, we will, but I'm afraid just to know that there won't be an acknowledgement there. But thank you, and don't worry, if it goes to the BTO, you don't need to duplicate to us.
Great, thanks for that thoroughness. Question here about recording more generally, about how do we know where the exact boundaries of the Wharfedale area are? I mean, essentially, it's the watershed of the Wharf from source down to, I think it's Rougemont Car near Wheaton.
Yeah,
there are details on our website.
There's a map. There's a map there. We do go outside it in one area. We cover Haverah Park. We overlap with Harrogate District. So we do all the Haverah Park area, Sandwith Plantation, so on. But aside from that, it's, as you say, Jeff, it's the watershed.
So the bits where the water would flow downhill into the wharf, essentially, exactly. If you're standing on the side of the hill and wondering which way it goes.
Yeah, exactly.
Just to return to the what 3 words question, You can set up what3 words to share latitude and longitude, but the easiest way is probably to use the grid reference finder that Nairi mentioned. If you collect the data using what3 words, it's very easy to put in there to convert to grid references, and that just keeps the workload for the recorders down a bit. So by all means use it to collect the data, but when you submit, it would be helpful to have that there. We're running a bit over, so I'll stop there and pass back to Helen to do thanks and wrap up.
Thanks, Jeff. Yes, so let me just say thank you so much to Nairi and to Andrew for 2 wonderful presentations. I know how much work goes into getting these things ready, and it's been absolutely lovely to be able to see the fruits of our labours in going out and looking for things and seeing what's turned up. I feel very kind of proud, really, when I think of these records that go back for years, charting the rise and fall of the various species in our area. It's lovely to be part of that community of people who have been taking care of nature, noticing it, and making it possible for future generations to understand a bit more about the environment that they live in. And so thank you very much again, Andrew and Nairi, for those excellent presentations. Just to repeat before we go, what Jeff has already said, that in 2 weeks' time, so I think that will be the 23rd of March, we're going to have our AGM, followed by a talk by Catherine Burton on how to be an effective recorder. So I think some of these questions that people have been asking tonight that perhaps haven't been fully answered this evening for lack of time, they'll be hopefully covered by Catherine in any case in a couple of weeks. So hoping very much to see you all there. Thank you very much for coming.